The forests surrounding Pine Hollow, Oregon, were unlike anywhere else. Thick walls of Douglas fir and cedar pressed against the small town, their crowns swaying in the endless winds rolling off the mountains. Mist clung to the valleys, fog settling low each morning as if the trees themselves were trying to hide their secrets. For locals, the forest was both a provider and a threat, a place that gave them hunting, fishing, and timber, but could just as easily swallow a man whole. And in the summer of 1990, that is exactly what seemed to happen. His name was Thomas Reed. To Pine Hollow, he wasn't just a ranger, he was the forest's steady guardian. In his early 40s, Thomas had spent over 15 years in the Park Service. He lived in a modest cabin on the edge of town, no more than a half-mile from the tree line. His neighbors remembered the faint glow of his lantern burning late into the night as he carefully logged patrol notes by hand. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, it carried weight. He was the kind of presence that made you believe the wilderness could be managed, even tamed. Thomas's days were a rhythm: sunrise patrols, mid-morning inspections, afternoons spent checking permits or guiding hikers back to safety. He was fit, weathered by the outdoors, with skin tanned from countless summers and eyes sharp enough to catch a detail most would miss. Colleagues said he had an uncanny ability to read the forest. A snapped twig, a misplaced stone, or a patch of ash on the ground told him stories others couldn't see. He often spoke about poachers, illegal hunters, who cut deeper into the woods than they should. And though he never said outright what he feared, his logbook hinted at rising tension. In the months before his disappearance, Thomas's notes grew more pointed. He wrote of fires smoldering in places far from campsites, of tracks crossing into restricted areas, of traps that looked recently set. He didn't accuse anyone directly, but the implication was clear. Someone was working in the forest at night, quietly and with purpose. Locals recalled that he seemed more cautious that spring. His words were careful, but his eyes betrayed worry. On June 17, 1990, Thomas rose before dawn as usual. He packed light: a canteen, his notebook, a rope coil, and a flashlight. He signed into the ranger log at the station, noting only trail inspection. It was a route he'd walked 100 times, beginning at the trailhead just north of Pine Hollow. His truck was parked neatly, keys in the ignition as always, logbook on the seat with a half-finished sentence: tracks leading east. The ink trailed off. That would be the last thing he ever wrote. When Thomas didn't return by sundown, no one was alarmed. Rangers often camped overnight during long inspections. But the following day, his absence was impossible to ignore. His truck still stood at the trailhead. His cabin was untouched, boots by the door, coffee cup on the table, bed neatly made. By the third day, concern turned into urgency. Search teams mobilized quickly. Dozens of volunteers from Pine Hollow joined law enforcement and fellow rangers. Helicopters flew overhead, their blades scattering birds from the canopy. Dogs were brought in, handlers guiding them along faint paths. The search grid stretched for miles, through ravines, ridges, and dense undergrowth. Voices echoed as people called his name, but the woods offered only silence. Days passed. The search grew frantic. Streams were dredged, caves explored, even abandoned logging roads checked for signs. But there were no broken branches, no scattered belongings, no trace of struggle. It was as though the forest itself had closed in around him, erasing his trail. For the town, disbelief quickly turned to fear. Pine Hollow was small, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Losing a man like Thomas Reed wasn't just strange. It was unthinkable. Families who had trusted the woods for generations began to look at them differently. Children were kept from wandering too far. Hunters whispered about curses, and locals debated what had really happened out there. Rumors filled the void that evidence left behind. Some believed Thomas had simply fallen, a hidden ravine, a misstep in the dark. Others were convinced he had crossed paths with someone he shouldn't have, perhaps the very poachers he had written about in his logbook. But without proof, everything remained speculation. By the end of the summer, the official search was suspended. His disappearance was filed under missing, presumed dead. For his family, it was no closure at all. His cabin stood frozen in time, the lantern on the table, coffee still staining the rim of a forgotten mug. For Pine Hollow, the silence was unbearable. Thomas Reed had walked into the forest on a June morning in 1990 and vanished without a trace. The disappearance of Thomas Reed spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire. At first, there was hope. Hope that he was out there somewhere, injured but alive, waiting to be found. But as days stretched into weeks, that hope began to wither. The forest was unforgiving, and everyone knew that time was not on his side. The search for Thomas became one of the largest operations the county had ever seen. Rangers from neighboring districts drove in to help. Volunteers poured in from nearby towns, carrying lanterns, ropes, and backpacks stuffed with supplies. Local businesses closed early so that shopkeepers and clerks could join the search parties. For Pine Hollow, this wasn't just about finding a missing man. It was about finding one of their own. Helicopters traced long arcs over the forest canopy. Their searchlights swept across valleys and ridges, cutting through fog and shadows. Dogs were led down trails and into ravines, handlers straining on leashes as the animals followed scents that ended abruptly, as if dissolving into the soil. Maps were spread across tables in the ranger station, grids marked and crossed out as each section of forest was combed. Yet, every line ended the same way. No trace. The Reed family clung desperately to the search. His sister, Margaret, stood at the trailhead each morning, watching as teams set out into the woods. She handed out bottled water, maps, and small thank you notes she had written overnight. Neighbors remembered her voice breaking as she repeated the same words. Just bring him home. His father, too old to walk the rugged terrain, waited at the ranger station for news that never came. Every time a radio crackled, he lifted his head in hope, only to drop it again in silence. Emotion ran high. At town meetings, voices cracked with anger and frustration. Some accused the search teams of overlooking key areas. Others insisted foul play had to be involved. For years, whispers had swirled about poaching in the woods, and Thomas had been vocal about it. Had he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have? Was someone determined to make sure he never reported what he saw? Law enforcement tried to temper the speculation, but they couldn't ignore the possibility. Deputies interviewed hunters, loggers, and anyone who had been near the forest that summer. A few names surfaced, men known for pushing boundaries, setting illegal traps, or trespassing in restricted zones. Yet, without evidence, the leads faded into nothing. By late July, fatigue set in. Volunteers who had once rushed to the woods each morning now dragged their feet, eyes heavy, boots worn down. The initial optimism had given way to exhaustion and quiet dread. The more time passed, the more the forest seemed to mock them. How could a man like Thomas Reed, who knew these woods better than anyone, vanish so completely? Still, the Reed family refused to let go. They organized vigils at the town square, candles flickering in rows as hymns were sung. Posters with Thomas's photo were nailed to trees, telephone poles, and shop windows. His rugged face stared back from every corner of Pine Hollow, a reminder that the man who had once protected the town now needed the town to protect his memory. As the months wore on, the questions grew darker. Some whispered that Thomas had walked away from his life, that he had grown tired of the responsibility, the solitude, the endless battles with those who disrespected the forest. Others wondered if he had been targeted. His logbook, recovered from his truck, contained detailed notes about unusual activity, tracks leading off trail, signs of campfires, and patterns of hunting that didn't match legal permits. He had written about them with increasing urgency. To some, it read like a warning. Winter came early that year, and with it, the official search was scaled back. Snow covered the trails, burying any lingering signs that might have been left behind. For many in Pine Hollow, it was the hardest blow of all. The forest was closing in, sealing whatever secrets it held beneath layers of ice and silence. The Reed family continued to fight. Margaret wrote letters to state officials, demanding that the search be reopened in the spring. She spoke to reporters, sometimes standing in front of the ranger station with tears in her eyes, describing her brother as a man who would never abandon his post. Her voice cracked as she insisted, "Someone knows something. This doesn't happen by accident." By the time spring returned in 1991, the case had shifted from urgent to unresolved. Law enforcement referred to it as an open investigation. But behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. The trail had gone cold. For Pine Hollow, life carried on, but the shadow of Thomas Reed's disappearance lingered. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the woods. Hunters spoke more quietly about where they set their traps, and every time the wind pushed through the trees at night, people said it carried his name. By the end of the decade, the case was little more than a painful memory. The Reed family still placed flowers at the trailhead each summer, but the search had ended. Officially, Thomas Reed was listed as missing, presumed dead. Unofficially, Pine Hollow carried an unease that never faded. 10 years passed before the forest finally gave up its secret. And when it did, the truth was stranger and far more unsettling than anyone had imagined. As the 1990s wore on, the disappearance of Thomas Reed slowly shifted from an urgent investigation to a haunting question that no one could answer. For Pine Hollow, it became a wound that scarred over but never healed. At first, the town buzzed with energy, search parties filling the woods, deputies chasing every possible lead. But as time passed and no evidence emerged, the buzz faded into silence. The case was still open on paper, but in reality, it had grown cold. Reports were filed and stored in metal cabinets at the sheriff's office, boxes marked "Reed Missing 1990." Every so often, a deputy would pull out the file, flip through the pages, and shake their head. There were no new tips, no fresh evidence, just the same unanswered questions staring back in black and white. Rumors, however, refused to die. Around Pine Hollow, people still whispered about what might have happened. Some clung to the idea that Thomas had simply wandered off trail, injured himself, and never made it back. But those who knew him best dismissed it instantly. Thomas Reed was not the kind of man who got lost in his own forest. Other theories grew darker. Hunters muttered about poachers, recalling Thomas's logbook notes of fires in restricted zones and tracks where no tracks should be. Locals spoke of men who had been seen hauling equipment into the forest at odd hours, men who didn't look like ordinary campers. One name surfaced more than once: a known poacher with a reputation for violence when cornered. But without evidence, the talk remained nothing more than rumor. The Reed family struggled in the face of silence. His sister Margaret carried the weight of unanswered questions everywhere she went. She continued to attend county meetings, reminding officials that her brother's case was not just a statistic, but a life stolen from Pine Hollow. Neighbors admired her persistence, but saw the toll it took. The lines on her face deepened, her voice grew sharper, and her faith in the system eroded. Meanwhile, the ranger station where Thomas had once signed his name grew quieter. A new ranger took over his patrol routes, but he often remarked that it felt like he was walking in someone else's shadow. Thomas's old cabin stood as a ghostly reminder, curtains drawn, furniture gathering dust, his belongings neatly arranged as if he would walk through the door at any moment. Tourists passing through sometimes asked about it, only to be met with uneasy silence from locals. Investigators tried to revive the case twice during the decade. Once in 1993, after a hiker claimed to have found scraps of fabric near the river, and again in 1996, when a hunter reported bones deep in the northern ridge. Both turned out to be dead ends, a discarded tarp in the first case and animal remains in the second. Each false lead felt like reopening an old wound, raising hope only to crush it again. For law enforcement, the problem was simple. No body, no evidence, no crime scene. Without those, the case had nothing to anchor it. And so, by the late 1990s, it had become a ghost file, buried under more recent cases that demanded attention. Still, Pine Hollow never forgot. People avoided the trailhead where his truck had been found, regarding it as cursed ground. Hunters swore they felt watched when they ventured too far east, into the deeper parts of the forest, and children, growing up in the shadow of the mystery, told stories around campfires, the ranger who vanished, the forest that kept him. As the new millennium approached, Margaret Reed continued to write letters to state officials, begging them not to close the file completely. She spoke at community events, her voice trembling but firm. My brother did not disappear into thin air. Someone knows what happened, and one day, the truth will come out. It was a promise she made not just to herself, but to the entire town. By the year 2000, a decade had passed. Pine Hollow had grown quieter, older. New families moved in, some unaware of the story, others treating it like folklore. But those who had lived through the summer of 1990 still carried the weight of unanswered questions. They didn't know it yet, but the forest was keeping its secret close, waiting for the day it would finally reveal what had happened to Thomas Reed. The summer of 2000 began like any other in Pine Hollow. Tourists returned, campers pitched tents along the river, and locals moved through their quiet routines. For many, the mystery of Thomas Reed had become a story told in low voices, something remembered but rarely discussed. 10 years had passed since his disappearance, and for most, it seemed the forest had chosen never to give up its secret. That changed in August, when a crew of forestry workers entered a remote section of the park to inspect storm damage. Strong winds earlier that year had snapped branches, scattered debris, and left towering pines leaning dangerously across trails. Their assignment was simple: clear hazards, mark unstable trees, and report anything unusual. By midday, the crew reached a clearing dominated by a giant cedar, its trunk broader than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. The tree had stood for centuries, its bark thick and scarred, its hollow core hidden from view. One worker noticed a faint opening where the bark had split during the storm, revealing a dark cavity inside. At first, it looked like nothing more than storm damage, another tree hollowed out by age and weather. But when a flashlight beam cut into the space, something unexpected reflected back. The workers called over their supervisor. Leaning closer, they saw what looked like scraps of fabric tangled in the shadows. The air was heavy, stale, with the unmistakable stillness of a place sealed away for years. One of them climbed partway up the trunk and shone the light deeper inside. What they saw made him stumble back. The cavity was not empty. Inside, concealed by the massive walls of the cedar, lay the remains of a man. Word spread quickly. The site was cordoned off, deputies arriving within the hour. Locals gathered at the edge of the clearing, whispering as yellow tape stretched between trees. For many, it was unthinkable. The idea that something so significant had been hidden all this time, in a place where search teams had once walked past. Investigators worked carefully, documenting every detail. The hollow had been almost completely sealed from view, its narrow opening camouflaged by bark and moss. Over time, wind and rain had closed the gap further, making it nearly invisible. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, the tree appeared like any other. Within days, the county coroner confirmed what many already suspected. The remains belonged to Thomas Reed. The revelation shook Pine Hollow. For a decade, people had debated, wondered, and speculated. Now, there was no denying it. The forest had held him all along. But with the answer came more questions. How had he ended up inside the hollow? Why had the original searches failed to uncover the site? And what, if anything, could explain the scraps of fabric that appeared out of place? For the Reed family, the news was both a relief and a heartbreak. Margaret wept when officials came to her door, her hands trembling as she signed papers confirming the findings. She had promised her brother would one day be found. Now, that promise was fulfilled, but in a way she had never wanted. The town gathered for a vigil that weekend. Hundreds of candles lit the town square, their glow flickering against the August night. Residents spoke of Thomas not as a ghostly figure in a mystery, but as a man who had served his community, who had walked the trails to keep others safe. The ceremony was solemn, but beneath it all was unease. Because while the discovery ended one chapter, it opened another. The investigation into how Thomas ended up in the hollow began immediately. Detectives studied his old logbooks, reread witness statements, and compared them against the condition of the tree. Theories spread as quickly as they had in 1990. Some believed it was a tragic accident, that he had sought shelter during a storm and never escaped. Others whispered darker possibilities. The scraps of fabric suggested more than misfortune. They weren't part of Thomas's ranger uniform. They belonged to someone else. The sheriff's office refused to comment, but locals drew their own conclusions. Many remembered the warnings Thomas had written before he vanished. Warnings about poachers in the woods. Men who moved quietly at night, setting traps where no one should. Men who might have seen Thomas Reed not as a guardian of the forest, but as a threat. For 10 years, Pine Hollow had lived with silence. Now, it had answers. But those answers only deepened the mystery. The forest had returned Thomas Reed. And with him came the undeniable truth. Whatever had happened in June 1990 had not been simple. The discovery of Thomas Reed inside the hollow cedar did more than close a decade-long mystery. It forced investigators to re-examine every detail of the case. Pine Hollow was no longer haunted by speculation about whether Thomas was alive. The truth was there, tangible, undeniable. But how he had ended up inside the tree remained the question that demanded an answer. Detectives reopened the file, this time with renewed urgency. The scraps of fabric found in the hollow were carefully tested. They were old, faded by time, but distinct. They did not match Thomas's ranger uniform. Instead, they matched the style of heavy canvas jackets sold in the region during the late 1980s, clothing commonly worn by hunters, and more specifically, by poachers. That detail turned the investigation in a new direction. Old interview notes were dusted off. Names that had been mentioned 10 years earlier resurfaced, especially those of men known for trespassing and setting illegal traps in the deeper woods. One name, in particular, appeared again and again. A local poacher who had lived on the edge of Pine Hollow, often in conflict with rangers over fines and confiscated gear. By 2001, the man was no longer the figure he had been a decade earlier. Age had worn him down. He lived quietly, rarely leaving his small property. But when deputies arrived at his door, the past came rushing back. At first, he denied everything. He insisted he had no part in Reed's disappearance, that the forest itself must have taken him. But as detectives laid out the evidence, the fabric, the logbook entries, the witness statements of his movements in the summer of 1990. The weight of the years pressed against him. Under questioning, his voice wavered, and finally, he broke. The confession was chilling in its simplicity. He admitted that Thomas had confronted him in the forest the morning he vanished. Thomas had caught him setting traps in a restricted zone, and a confrontation followed. The poacher claimed he panicked. In the chaos, Thomas collapsed. Fearing the consequences, he dragged the body to the hollow cedar, a tree he knew well from years of hunting. The cavity was large enough to conceal a man, and he believed the forest itself would keep the secret. For 10 years, it did. When the confession became public, Pine Hollow erupted in shock. The man many had suspected quietly for years had finally admitted the truth. For some, it brought closure. The mystery was no longer a mystery. For others, it only deepened the pain. The idea that Thomas's fate had been sealed not by the wilderness, but by a neighbor, a man they passed in town for a decade, was almost too much to bear. The Reed family received the news with a mix of sorrow and resignation. Margaret, who had fought for answers for 10 long years, stood before reporters and said softly, "We have the truth now, but it doesn't bring him back." Her words echoed through the square, heavy with the weight of grief. The trial was swift. The poacher's age and failing health made the process almost anticlimactic. He was sentenced, but for many, punishment felt symbolic. The real punishment had already been lived by the Reed family and by Pine Hollow. A decade of silence, of unanswered questions, of nights spent wondering. In the end, the forest that had hidden Thomas Reed for 10 years became the place where his memory was honored. A plaque was placed at the trailhead near where his truck had once been found, engraved with his name and the years of his service. Each summer, hikers and rangers paused to read it, reminded of the man who gave his life protecting the woods. Yet even with the confession, whispers never fully faded. Some locals argued that the poacher's story didn't explain everything. The missing details in the logbook, the fact that search teams had scoured the area near the cedar without success, the eerie way the hollow seemed sealed until the storm of 2000 opened it. Was there more to the story? Was the confession only part of the truth? For Pine Hollow, the case was officially closed. For the community, it would never truly end. Thomas Reed had vanished in 1990. He was found 10 years later inside a hollow cedar. And though justice was delayed, the truth finally surfaced, proving that sometimes the darkest secrets aren't buried underground. Sometimes they stand tall among us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for time to reveal them.